When you think of NHL 94, you normally think about the Sega Genesis version of the game. This is the classic game that most of us grew up with. This is the game that keeps us coming back for more. Of course, those of us who are sophisticated video game fans know that the forgotten Sega CD version is the best. There's really nothing out there quite like this game. But what about the Super Nintendo version of NHL 94? Ah yes, the Super Nintendo version of NHL 94. It gets no love, and honestly, if you go back and watch that little clip again, you can see why. The frame rate is below standard, especially if you compare it with the Sega CD version, which is smooth like butter. You could say that it's an underdog. Well, that's kind of like the 1992-93 Ottawa Senators, of course. After being absent for almost 60 years, Ottawa finally got another top-level professional hockey team that year. The Senators, of course, had originally moved to St. Louis in the middle of the 1930s, mostly because the team was bankrupt. And yeah, it turns out that a small town like Ottawa wasn't exactly great for big-time hockey, even if Ottawa was the nation's capital. Now, Ottawa is much bigger these days. I know because I lived there and worked there for a couple of years about a decade ago. It's a lot more like a city nowadays, though the locals will still tell you that the best part about Ottawa is that it's only about 4 hours from Toronto and 2 hours from Montreal. Now, I did hear from other locals that a couple decades ago, you would occasionally see like loose farm animals, especially pigs, kind of wandering around through town. It's not quite like that anymore, but it still is a pretty quiet place, even if you go to an NHL game. Of course, the crowd was a little bit more into it back when the Senators played their first game in October 1992. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't remember ever seeing any of these Roman soldier guys when I took my family to a game up there. Of course, the expansion Senators were a pretty awful team in general. And that's what expansion teams are like, right? They're filled with the cast-offs, the guys that you've never heard of before. And man, those Senators sure had their share of nobodies. The best players on the original Senators were guys like Sylvain Turgeon, who had managed a few All-Star appearances in the late 1980s, and I love this card. Turgeon managed to lead the team with 25 goals in real life that season. That might not seem like much, but it was pretty helpful for a team that only scored 200 goals all season long. Sadly, Turgeon found himself out of the league after the 1995 season, ending his career at the ripe old age of 30. I mean, I can't even blame the Senators for spending too much money on veterans, right? Because this guy wasn't that old. I just gotta chalk that one up to dumb luck. Players like Neil Brady were probably more representative of the expansion Senators. Brady was such an obscure player before 1992 that I'm really having a hard time finding his hockey cards. He was chiefly a minor league player with only 29 games in the NHL in 3 seasons before joining Ottawa at age 24. Brady rewarded his team by putting up a whopping -25 plus-minus rating in the 1992 season. And for all intents and purposes, that was it for his NHL career. Now, I don't want to disparage any of these guys, right? Obviously, I mean, geez, I can't even, ice skate, right? I go on there and I'm, sliding around. I can't do anything, right? Clearly, these guys are far more athletic than I've ever been or ever will be. But the thing is that the Senators were an underdog team made up of underdog and marginal players. This is the sort of team that you just love to root for, but this is also the sort of team that really frustrates you when you want them to win. And that lovable loser spirit inspired me when I turned on the Super Nintendo version of NHL 94 for a serious project. Like a fool, I decided to pilot the Ottawa Senators into the playoffs, choosing the best of 7 option. Our reward was to play against the Boston Bruins, who had the second best record in the NHL that season. Yeah, thanks, EA, right? Way to make it fair, right? Oh, yeah, you chose, the worst team in the league in the game, right? Well, fine, you're going to play against one of the hardest teams in the league. I mean, we couldn't play against, Quebec or Montreal or something. We had to play the Bruins, whatever. Anyway, the funny thing is that we had some real opportunities to score early on in the first game. We were able to keep the puck in the attacking zone, and I thought for a minute that we might pull off a massive upset. But then we gave up a goal early in the second period to Dmitry Kvartalnov. Yeah, it's not fair. It's just simply not fair. Kvartalnov, right, he set a record with 1 point in his first 14 NHL games in 1992. That was his rookie season. The guy was 26 years old, and he was already an established star in Russia, including on the Soviet national team, you know, the one that was famous throughout the 80s. And meanwhile, in Ottawa, we had a bunch of guys who weren't even stars in the minor leagues. To my surprise, however, we were able to come back right away thanks to this beautiful wraparound goal. Things were looking good until I made a silly mistake to give the Bruins the lead again. But then that wraparound trick worked a second time seconds later, and we were all tied up at 2 each. You see, one of the things about NHL 94 on the Super Nintendo is that the controls are actually surprisingly good. I'm not saying that the Genesis or Sega CD versions had bad controls. Those games are great and they're smooth, but the Super Nintendo game really does make you feel in control of what's going on. I felt like I could easily do whatever I really wanted to do without having to worry a lot about like sliding in the wrong direction or something really strange happening. Sure, we gave up another goal seconds later, but that was because of another mistake on my part. And though we didn't quite have enough time to come back, at least we gave it our best effort. And of course, the most important part of all is that this felt fair. It felt like we actually had a chance, even though our team was totally outclassed. And that's the most important part of these games, right? It's about playing the games. Now, as much as I like the controls, I really do need to talk a little bit here about the frame rate. After playing the Sega CD version, going to the Super NES version really did feel like a step down. There's no way around it. I mean, the Sega CD version feels like an absolute dream compared to the jerky nature of the Super NES game. And the Sega Genesis version is also noticeably smoother than the Super NES game, and the graphics look better too. Despite the Super Nintendo's famously larger color palette, the game honestly looks kind of dull. So I think that that's the thing that hurt the Super Nintendo version the most. The Genesis had that famous 68,000 Motorola processor. That's the thing that most programmers in the late 80s and the early 90s already knew how to use. Now the Super Nintendo, they were worried about it being too expensive, so they threw together like this janky solution to try to compete. And it does work pretty well for RPGs and all the famous games and stuff like that, but when it came to the faster games, it didn't work that well out of the box. If you had like the Super FX chip or something like that, it was a little bit better, but they didn't for NHL 94. However, in the defense of the Super Nintendo, the animations in NHL 94 are really quite good. They're much better than I expected. There's lots of little great stuff here, like the direction that the player's head faces, the way that they fall to the ice, just those little things like that. Honestly, it's a much better game graphically than people give it credit for. Now, I'm not going to necessarily say that it was like better than the Sega versions. I don't think that it was. But NHL 94 on the Super NES is legitimately a great game. Not just a good game. This is a great game. I had a ton of fun playing this, and the good graphics really did have a lot to do with it. This is certainly miles above any other Super Nintendo hockey game up to that point, that's for sure. Anyway, Game 2 went on with no scoring. It was a real defensive affair. But then, about halfway through a third period power play, none other than Neil Brady managed to score a goal. About 2 minutes later, we had another one of those one-timers, and we were up for good. It always feels good to win on the road. And it's a fun game to play once you get into it. Now, there are some idiosyncrasies, of course, largely because of the hardware limits of the Super Nintendo. So, for example, when we won the opening faceoff at home in Game 3, the crowd didn't respond at all. You do get some brief boos when the home players are pushed around, but usually the sound chip has to go back to play some other thing according to the game's code. These limitations are chiefly because of the inferior sound hardware inside the Super Nintendo. Now, this is actually most obvious if you play later games like NBA Hang Time on the Super Nintendo. If you play that game, you hear the announcer say the same thing over and over again. This is not because the programmers were total morons. Well, maybe they were morons, but in this case, it's not their fault. Now, this is because the Super Nintendo sound hardware was completely underpowered. Now, I know that that's a surprise if you played like great games like, Final Fantasy III with like the opera scene and stuff like that, but it really is true. Anyway, we went down early in Game 3, and I swear that it wasn't my fault. It must have been the audio. We had chances to score, but I was probably too focused on one-timers and didn't try enough creative tricks. Still, I feel like we got in our share of shots, and we certainly did have our chances. The Bruins eventually scored again on one of those ridiculous plays, a play that showed that our defense just simply was not good enough to keep up with this team. By the end of the game, we were having a hard time just getting control of the puck, not a great thing to do in front of the hometown fans. Anyway, that put us down 2-1 in the series. But Game 4 was at home. If we could just win Game 4 and sneak out something in Game 5, we'd have the home ice advantage. And all I could think about is how great my video would be if I could actually get the expansion Senators to win a playoff series. So I went all out. Game 4 of this series was really the highlight of the whole thing. This was a hard-fought, hard-hitting game and was really the game that made me fall in love with the Super Nintendo version of NHL 94. Moments like this one had me screaming, and it's not every day that a hockey video game brings out an emotional response in you. I know, it's just a game. But seriously, did they have to make my forwards so slow and their defenders so fast? Now, when I was a kid, I used to complain to my mom all the time that, the Nintendo was cheating. Well, Game 4 of this series is my proof. Mom, I was right all along, it was cheating. We went minute after minute without a goal, though I kept on trying. It might not have been pretty, but I made every single moment count. In the end, the defense held strong for both teams, which meant that this game went to overtime. I swear, just getting to overtime against the Bruins, that should count as a win for us. Let's just go straight to Game 5. No need to worry about what happens in overtime. Let's just call it here and move on. Anyway, our defense held strong throughout the first overtime. The problem is that we had a hard time mounting anything even remotely resembling an attack. After 5 minutes of this, we wound up with the second overtime. We did manage some miraculous stops despite having a clearly outclassed defense. But then, after what I thought was a beautiful save, the end of the game came all too suddenly. And you guessed it, it was that man again, Kvartalnov. The beauty of a great sports game is that it makes you feel drama and emotion. You find yourself caught up in it against your best judgment, right? You know intellectually that this is just a game, but somewhere deep down inside you have that need to win. You got to prove yourself. You got to show to the world that you can succeed against all odds. Now that's the mark of a truly great sports game. It brings out these emotions inside of you. That's what I felt like going into Game 5. I mean, NHL PA 93 on the Super NES isn't necessarily a bad game. But if you watch it or play it just for a few seconds, you'll realize that the speed is way off. The game is like a snail running against a rabbit. NHL 94 on the Super Nintendo just feels real, and the speed here has a lot to do with it. And so when our defense fell apart and that Russian scored yet again, I really felt frustrated. Now, I'll be honest with you, I don't have the nerves and the calmness to survive in real life as an NHL coach, right? I was ready to blow my top when we went down in Game 5 like that, and this is where things got exciting. None other than Neil Brady scored to equalize, and just like that, we had a brand new ball game. However, we forgot to play defense once again, and the Bruins were up 2-1. Big breaks started to go our way, such as this one right here, where I somehow managed to win a penalty shot. The unfortunate thing is that I didn't know what I was doing at all. And seconds later, our goalie decided to get out of the way to let Kvartalnov score again. It was just like Moses parting the Red Sea. I swear I see Kvartalnov in my nightmares. I mean, how come the Senators couldn't draft him? What was wrong with him? Was he like too good for Ottawa? Anyway, around this stage, I was just ready to pack it in. But there was still hope. There is always hope. See, the thing that made NHL 94 stand out on the Super Nintendo is that it was actually a really decent hockey game, unlike some of its competitors. If you try to play a game like NHL Stanley Cup, you'll spend most of your time trying to figure out what you're doing. Or if you're like me, you'll spend most of your time cleaning the vomit off of your carpet. This game makes me feel sick. But you know, EA's game was about the game itself. It wasn't about the flashy graphics and the 3D views and the Mode 7 and all of that. And that's the reason why NHL 94 was so successful. It was all about the gameplay. It was not all about things that look nice in the magazine ad or whatever. It turns out the gamers care about gameplay, and they don't care that much about it being like 3D or something. That good gameplay helped us out here. I swear that I saw this open up before it happened. We were only one goal away from tying it, but time was running out. And then, after a key save, it happened. One of the biggest miracles I've ever seen in a hockey video game. Turgeon finally came through for us, and I swear that this one was skill, not luck. And we proved it. We proved that we could play with them. The cast-offs and the misfits on the Ottawa Senators were now bona fide NHL players. Sure, you can go ahead. Have your Russian superstars, right? Take them. We don't want them. We don't need them. We got the guys that we need. We're going to get back into this series, and we're going to win the whole thing, and we're going to surprise the world. We went to overtime, of course, for the second game in a row. Now, I'll tell you, one of the problems with this game is that it gets stuck in a highlight loop like this. I wanted to get the game on, but the highlights showed up faster than I could navigate the menus. The highlight idea was a good idea, sure, but it really could have used some work. I mean, it's fun to watch, but it would be nice to have an option to choose whether to watch them or not, right? It kind of shoves it down your throat, like I push start and then the next one comes up right away, right? What's up with that? I don't know why EA decided to do that, whatever. Anyway, overtime came and I knew that this was our moment to shine. We had chances right away, but we managed to blow them. And then, after we ran into a defensive brick wall, they pulled out one of their one-timer tricks. Game over. And that was that. We had 2 overtime games, and we had a lot of drama. We did win 1 of the 5 games, which I think is great for a team that only won 10 games in real life. But our dreams did not come true. Hey, at least we got a guy on the 3 stars list. The game showed us that Montreal would play Boston next. And then the simulation ended and it was back to the main menu. Now I know what you're thinking, right? That is kind of anticlimactic, but that's NHL 94 on the Super NES for you, right? It is a better game than you think. If you haven't played it yet, or if it's been a long time, go dust it off, give it a try again. The controls are surprisingly good. The graphics are a little bit wonky, the sound is not perfect, but it's still a lot better than the other Super Nintendo hockey games. Honestly, I do think that this one is an overlooked classic. This is a true underdog. It's just like those 1992 Ottawa Senators. And we're going to get them next time.